Hey everyone, welcome to the Nikhil Hogan Show. My guest today is Peter Pullman. He is the author of Wail, The Life of Bud Powell, receiving a Grammy nomination in 1994 for Best Album Notes on the album The Complete Bud Powell on Verve, led Pullman to begin work on the biographical project. A truly exhaustive work, Pullman conducted 300 formal interviews, 500 informal ones, research in private archives, police records, FBI files, even petitioning New York State psychiatric hospitals, and also fact-finding trips to Europe. The book was a culmination of 12 years of work and is probably the definitive book on Bud Powell's life. Peter, it's really a pleasure to have you on the show today.
Hello, Nikhil. Thank you.
You've done really an amazing job on this biography. And off the broadcast, we were talking a little bit about Bud Powell's background, and you mentioned that he might have started at the age of 5, and you mentioned that he also didn't finish high school, and he had already started to play music, and he had perhaps a teacher. We were talking about his first piano teacher, who was from Jamaica. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, I don't know where in the Caribbean he was from, to be honest, but I have a feeling that he had a British education, formal education, and he had a reputation as being an excellent classical instructor. And because Bud Powell's father had been a pianist and had a love of music, he sought Mr. Rawlins, that was his name, he sought him out and brought him around to teach his son. And I can't swear, but I think Powell was about age 5. And from then he learned a particular technique that Rawlins championed, and it was, he called it a drop touch technique. And it was a certain way that one held one's arms and body, elbows above the keys so that the fingers could strike the keys with more force. And that was his idea, and Bud Powell took to it very well.
And how long did he take lessons with Mr. Rawlins?
I'll guess about 5 years, maybe 7 years. The father wanted him to stay with it, but as I said before, Powell was getting a reputation. He, in fact, probably by age 10, he was playing in people's apartments. There was a tradition in Harlem called the rent party, and this was people's homes who had pianos in their front parlors would invite musicians to play and then pass a hat around for money to help them pay the rent. Remember, Harlem in the 30s was slow to recover from the Depression that began in 1929. And, of course, people in Harlem had always suffered from all the depredations of racism and such and had a hard time paying the rent. So Powell was appearing at these rent parties maybe by age 10, and he had a reputation in particular for imitating Fats Waller, and then a little later, Art Tatum, as he had heard them on radio. And because of that, his interest in classical music waned somewhat. I don't know when, but if he had 5 or 7 years of training, as his reputation grew, he had less and less interest in classical music.
Were there any famous musicians in Harlem or in that area, and he got to see them, or he was acquainted with any famous pianists at the time?
Well, not acquainted. As a young man, as I said, he heard them all on radio, and then when they appeared in New York, or in the case of Fats Waller, he was born here in New York. So it's not that he was too young to see them perform, except in the nice weather if it was someone's apartment, or more likely because Waller had a reputation already. And Tatum, too, by the time he came to New York, he was known for his performances on radio. So if Willie the Lion Smith, if any of these guys happened to be playing anywhere around Harlem in a small venue, maybe Subterranean or whatever, a small club, I don't know, maybe as a kid he walked by and he stuck his head in the door or something like that. But he would never have been allowed in to a place where there was a formal performance going on. Certainly if it was a bar, he couldn't go in. But it was all in the air. All this music was happening, and those 3 pianists had legendary, by the end of the 30s, they were all legends, even the mid-30s, in Harlem. So it was more what was in and around him, and then what he was hearing from other people.
That was the age of the big band, was it not? And did Bud start to join big bands and play with them?
Yes, his initial, his very first performances were in small groups. He appeared, aside from in people's homes in the neighborhood in Harlem, he did move around a little bit as his reputation grew. And his very first performances, at least as far as I know, were in a place very far from Harlem, in New York City, but at the other end of the city. I don't know how he got the job. I guess word of mouth. Somebody said this kid, and he was probably just a kid. He might have been 14 or something when this happened, or 13, 14. And he was able to play at some little place in what's called Coney Island. It's on the water, the other end of New York City. But then he attracted interest, and he played with a group called Sunset Royals. That's one of the first name bands that he played with. From there, he had a couple of other opportunities in bands, and then his big break was to play with Cootie Williams. In 1943, he was invited to join Cootie Williams, who had left Duke Ellington and had a big orchestra, very successful. And that's when he got his first real big break.
When did really bebop and that modern jazz, as it was termed, begin in the 40s? And how did Bud Powell get into that music? And he's regarded as somewhat of a pioneer on the piano. How did he get into that style of music?
I think, again, by wandering the neighborhood and hearing the sounds. The very first ideas that what we can say percolated in Harlem, and all of the genesis of modern jazz took place in Harlem. Of course, there were people who came from other places and were thinking along those lines. Tad Dameron had come from Cleveland, and he was already experimenting. But the group interplay and the use of the certain chords and certain intervals, which we call modern jazz, really happened in Harlem. And it goes back to about 1938. And while Powell was only 14, turned 14 in 1938, there was one place in particular called Uptown House, which was near enough to his home that he walked by, and he would have heard those sounds. And I guess talking with musicians or other kids his age who were aspiring, he would have known that if he could ever get into it was run by a man named Clark Monroe, Uptown House, that's where it was happening. There were smaller places, and again, people's apartments where ideas were being exchanged. But it was more that this ambient, this stuff that was in the air, new ideas, and that really excited him. And it might have been as early as 38 or 39. There are legendary stories about Charlie Parker playing at Uptown House in 1939. Kenny Clark, who was there, testified to Parker having passed through New York in 39 and appearing at Uptown House. So the word got around. There were these new ideas, there were these young musicians, and there were small places around Harlem where it was happening. And Powell was absorbing that even before he could get inside and join them.
When did he meet Thelonious Monk? Was it around the same time?
Little later. A lot of the histories say that the first venue where modern jazz was played in any sort of formal way was at Minton's. The owner was Henry Minton, but that's usually the place is called Playhouse, Minton's Playhouse or Playhouse. And the histories are all wrong because Uptown House, it was happening at Uptown House first. However, because Monk is generally considered the intellectual fulcrum or center of this new music, and he deserves that title. I mean, he really was he had all the theory, he had all the ideas, and all the musicians gathered around him to learn what was possible on their instrument. Because Monk played at Playhouse, around 1940, 41. It's assumed that's where it started. But because Powell wasn't there, he only met Monk in 42. That's the best I can tell. Again, this is all informal stuff. There's nobody
Right.
who was writing things down.
Yeah.
But he probably heard that this guy Monk was playing at Minton's, and he wanted to be part of that. But I assume he could not have gotten in underage. He might have snuck in or something. But it was only when Monk was at Playhouse that Powell heard about him, and that maybe I guess it's 1942, and then Monk brought Powell to Playhouse. Monk's idea was, this kid can do stuff I can't do. I mean, I've got the theories, I have all the ideas, but this man's technique is beyond this boy's technique is beyond mine. So shortly after they met, I think he brought him to Playhouse to do something in the after hours, probably.
I was reading the Thelonious Monk biography, and there's mentions of him teaching Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker how it goes, and there's Charlie Christian before Parker and Gillespie. The theoretical underpinnings, would you say that came from Monk, Bebop, even though he
Yes.
wasn't really considered a bebopper, right?
That's right. First off, the term is one that most of the musicians of the time rejected. Now, I don't think anyone likes labels. I don't care if you're talking about labeling somebody by the way he looks or the way she does this or that or what someone believes in. Nobody likes labels, I don't think. I know I don't. And the musicians didn't like bebop, the label. They were doing what, each one was trying to do his own ideas. If there's anything that Monk taught beyond chord intervals and rhythmic patterns and things, he taught them to be themselves. He taught them to follow their muse. And the great ones did. And it's true that Monk was the one that others gathered around. And Charlie Christian is a very early influence. You could say that Christian, coming from Oklahoma, had his own ideas, met Monk, and they started playing at Playhouse, and it was just this wonderful synergy that developed, because Monk was a big man too. He was a proud man. He was a big man, and he was so confident in what he was doing that these other guys, and of course Monk's at the piano, so he's got all that advantage of all that you can do there. And then people like Charlie Christian came along, and they said, well, I've been thinking of some of these things too. And Christian was there from the beginning. In fact, after his Benny Goodman gigs in Midtown, the big orchestra, then he went uptown, because that's where he could stretch out. That's where he could try his new ideas. And he had this guy, Monk, who was the leader. And yes, they are before. Monk taught Gillespie a lot. I downplay Gillespie's importance, and I'm sure there's a lot of jazz historians who want to kill me for that. But I believe that Monk was the genius, and it's not that Gillespie wasn't great, but it's true. It's Monk first, along with Christian and a couple of others. Jimmy Blanton is a name that should be included, because he was there at the very beginning with Charlie Christian, as well as Monk.
Jimmy Blanton, what instrument did he play?
He was the bassist in the Ellington Orchestra. And it's similar in that Blanton was Ellington's great bassist, Charlie Christian was Benny Goodman's great guitarist, and yet when their paying gigs were over, they wanted to go uptown, and they sought out Monk, and they were all together experimenting from about 1940.
You mentioned Monk's height, and I just can't help but ask, how tall was Bud Powell?
Oh, I don't know exactly, but considerably shorter than Monk. Monk was probably 6'2" or something, and Powell might have been 5'10", something like that, I'm guessing.
Oh, kind of a normal height. I mean, just kind of average.
Yes, I think it's fair to say that Powell was of average height. He was of average looks. He was neither homely or particularly magnetic and attractive. He was very concerned with his appearance, and so he loved to appear in a good suit, and he tried to, in his heyday anyway, the pictures show him as Ira Gittler said, well-togged, an unusual expression, meaning that he was meticulous about his appearance. But as I think I wrote in the book, you might have mistaken him for a banker or an insurance salesman or something, aside from the issue that African Americans didn't have those opportunities often. But I mean, he dressed conservatively and neatly, but nothing showy or anything like that. Some jazz musicians wanted to stand out by the way they looked. That wasn't Powell at all.
I think there's an anecdote in your book where I think Bud Powell is talking to Billy Taylor, and Billy Taylor is saying, I'm really trying to learn Art Tatum's style, and Bud Powell is saying, I'm actually more interested in what Charlie Parker is doing.
Oh, I'm glad you chose that. I think it's an important moment in the Bud Powell narrative, in his development. And Billy Taylor gave it to me himself. Billy Taylor was a wonderful historian, really, of the music, as well as a great pianist. And I think Dr. Taylor, as we called him, told me this story to indicate that for Taylor, it was all about technique on the instrument. And there, of course, Tatum was the ne plus ultra. Nobody had more technique than Art Tatum,
Yeah.
not in the history of jazz. And there isn't a jazz musician alive who will say otherwise. There's something about Art Tatum's ability that even the great classical pianists came to watch him play. He had so much. So for Taylor, nothing was more important than mastering his instrument, and there was no one to learn from more than Art Tatum. But Powell had a lot of technique, and he wasn't insecure about that technique. He didn't feel that he needed more once he started to play with others. What interested him were ideas, and the modern ideas captivated him. So Parker, who had tremendous technique on his horn, but at a certain point, I don't think Parker continued to practice and to play scales and things. I think Parker had his technique, he was confident in it, and what he was after was ideas. So he attracted Powell because those ideas were a break from the swing music tradition. They were something beyond. In fact, even to the end of Parker's life, he was talking about avant-garde composers who interested in Edgar Varese and people like that. So Parker was a seeker after new ideas, and that's what Powell wanted to do.
Can we date that conversation he had with Billy Taylor?
I think it's about 1944, because Powell was probably still with Cootie Williams, and Taylor told me the story that it happened in a hotel, obviously a segregated hotel, 1944, and they were probably both on the road. At least Powell was with the Cootie Williams band. Taylor was from Washington, D.C. If it took place there, then Taylor was still playing locally. Or it could have been when Taylor came to New York. I don't remember. I think that was about 45 or something, 46. But I have a feeling it's in that period where Powell has not gone off on his own yet. I mean, he's still employed in an orchestra. Taylor is just getting his career going. And they were at that point where a musical conversation, they might influence each other. They were young enough and hungry. So, I think it took place at a breakfast or something. And they were eager to say, well, what are you doing? Well, what are you doing? And maybe taking ideas from each other. But Powell was impatient. He was an impulsive guy. And I think Taylor was a calmer, a more mature, emotionally mature person. So when Taylor is talking, he's talking about technique, and Powell, I think, I'm projecting now, but I think Powell got a little impatient, and that's what Taylor explained it to me. He says, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about something new. That's what Bird is doing. That's what I want.
Now we get to I think everyone's interested in this topic, Bud Powell's relationship with Charlie Parker. And I'm sure that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And so obviously he was sort of enthralled with Charlie Parker at the beginning. And I mean, it's a big topic, right? So let's talk about the beginning. Do we have any research on how their relationship was at the beginning when they first met, how that was? Do we have any information there?
Only the words of musicians I was able to talk to who were very plain with me on the topic, that in those early years there was no question that Powell was, as you put it, enthralled to Parker. Parker was not only someone who was seeking new ideas, new ways of phrasing on his instrument, but Parker was brash and Parker was confident. He wasn't as outgoing as Dizzy Gillespie. He wasn't as well dressed as Miles Davis in a couple of years when he came on the scene, but Parker knew what he could do, and he attracted people who wanted to play his music. That was the key, and I think Powell saw that if you have the technique and you have the ideas, people will come around you, and then you can maybe get the kind of jobs where it's your band and people play what you're doing. They want to play your idea. So Parker already had that when Powell met him. I can't date when that was, but Parker was making records, and Parker was just, as I said, more magnetic for the way he played than for the way he looked or his anything. He was supposedly a very witty guy, but Gillespie was the real performer, so to speak, the real kind of comic performer. Parker was all about seriousness on the instrument, and I think that Powell initially idolized him. And this also comes through in musician comments that I didn't get, but in the written histories that people say, and it's a cliche which I think needs to be downplayed. But the cliche was that Bud Powell took what Charlie Parker was doing on saxophone and translated it, or you might say transposed it to the piano. And you can hear it in some of the phrasing. There's an aggressiveness to the way he plays certain phrases. The first note of a phrase is struck very hard, and that's the way you can hear Parker often with a phrase, that first note or two are played hard, and then he sort of falls off those notes and plays softly. And that hitting that first note hard was a Powell signature, and I think he got that from Parker.
Do we know how much they played together? And do we have any information of if they played in a band, if they jammed together, at least in the early part of their relationship?
No, it's more a missed opportunity. There is a document. I think one or two recordings that were. I mean, they're not commercial recordings, but Parker appeared for a week in Cootie Williams's band, and it's hard for me to recall all this, but I think it was in February of 1945. The Cootie Williams band was playing in Harlem. It was a week or 2 week engagement. I think it's at the Apollo Theater, and Parker guested. Now, knowing Parker, I mean, he might not have shown up for every performance. He was notorious for that, and that's another thing Powell got from him, unreliability. But this comes with genius. At least they thought it did. If you're a genius, they should be grateful you show up at all, right?
Yeah.
So Parker guested with Cootie Williams in February of 45, and it's one of these unfortunate things of history that Powell's last performance with Cootie Williams was January 19th, I think it was, of 45. So had Powell not had an unfortunate incident, which is documented in the book, which forced him to leave the Cootie Williams band, they would have played together there. There's no doubt that there were jams in Harlem at that time, 44, 45. They must have appeared. But remember that Powell was on the road with the Cootie Williams band, although Harlem was still home, and Parker was gaining a lot of attention and attraction, and he was all over. Wherever anybody offered him the money, I mean, he was in demand a lot. But there's probably jams, but no, there is no recording together, no documented appearance together until 1947.
And is that when Donnelly and
That's
happened?
right.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. That's the session, yeah.
How about Dizzy Gillespie? Did he jam? What was his work schedule like at the time?
Well, he was extremely active for all the good reasons, because he was a virtuoso on his instrument, and he had a great a real hunger to play new ideas. And as I said, he got a lot from Monk and from other. Look, all these musicians, all great musicians are sponges. They absorb everything they can. Anything that's out there. It's the thing about music. It's all in the air. It's all in the atmosphere. And you pull out of the atmosphere whatever strikes your fancy. So Gillespie was playing. He was very active, more active than Parker, I believe, at this time. And in 1943, probably the pivotal event for modern jazz to that point was an engagement in Midtown. Now, that was rare because African Americans had a hard time playing anywhere in Midtown because of the unfortunate situation. But Gillespie got a band together, and in November of 43, he opened at a club. and he had all the great modern musicians, and he wanted Bud Powell. Now, the fact that he wanted him, he was aware of him. He knew that Powell had this tremendous technique, kind of fire in him, when he played solos, and that he, too, wanted the new sound. He wanted to explore things. But it was at that moment that Cootie Williams offered Powell the chance to play in the big band, and Powell took that job. So had he taken the Gillespie job, which was less secure, less money, all that, but had he done it, they would have been in the same band in 1943. And that band was a tremendous breakthrough for modern jazz and had great musicians. And everybody says, oh, if only Bud Powell, but he didn't. So again, they probably had appeared on some bandstands informally here and there, but there's no documentation of them playing together.
Then 1947. How did 1947 happen? It seems like you're trying to corral cats to get together, but eventually it did happen, and they did play together.
Parker was under contract to Savoy Records. He had been under contract to Dial Records and made what I think are his greatest recordings, first on the West Coast for Dial. It was started by a man in Los Angeles, I believe. And then the record company moved east to New York when this guy, picked up his business and moved it. And Parker recorded for Dial in New York. Then he recorded for Savoy, which was a New York-based label, actually a New Jersey-based label. And Parker was under contract, and so he got Miles Davis and, oh boy, you're going to test me now who else is on the date. I'm a little rusty. But he got this band together, and Parker, I assume, chose Powell to play piano. So it's a legendary session. Everybody can look it up online or in a discography. And the tune that is most fondly remembered is Donna Lee.
Even though he might not have recorded with Parker as much, he did record with Sonny Stitt. And there was one recording where they were playing just straight bebop. They played, I think, like Sonny Stitt, J.J. Johnson, something like that with that album. Incredible. That's 49, I guess. That's 1949, right? All God's...
Well, okay, there's two things. There is some music from 46, and you could call that bebop if you like. Powell's a sideman, and he's not a sideman to Parker in 46. It's to other musicians, but there's a handful of record dates. Kenny Clark leads a session. Dexter Gordon leads a session. I mean, there's enough that's going on in 46 that you'd have to include that in any conversation about bebop, if you want to call it that. But Powell's role in that is as a sideman. He didn't contribute. I don't think he contributed any composition. He may have contributed an idea in between tracks. He might have said something. But he was a sideman, very much so. And the exposure with Parker in 47 is more important, because while he's a sideman, again, we are talking about Charlie Parker here. And so in history, and Miles Davis is on the date, and there's dispute about who wrote Donna Lee, and I won't go into that. But this is historic, this meeting of the three of them. And this eclipses, in terms of moving Powell's career forward, this eclipses anything he did in 46.
As a historian, can you date the peak of the interest in bebop? And because I believe sometime in the 50s, people were saying they were losing interest in bebop. But what years were the peak of bebop?
1949. I think Powell, we haven't gotten into any of Powell's personal problems, and we don't need to, but Powell was off the scene. After the Parker session, it's the only record he made in 1947 was with Charlie Parker. It's the only one. And he was off the scene completely in 1948 and part of 47, the end of 47, and the beginning of 49. So that's the bad news. The good news is that when he came out in April from the hospital in April of 49, bebop, or modern jazz, was all over Midtown. The segregation laws, they weren't really laws, they were just practices. The clubs were becoming open, and it was integrated bands, and there were integrated audiences, and this is really the flowering of modern jazz. And 52nd Street was the axis around which so much activity rotated, and Powell was there for it. and he was so eager to play. He came out in '49 April, and everybody wanted him, and he wanted to be with everybody. So you could say that's when the modern thing is at its peak. And Powell's greatest period, that is a period of his celebrity, the period where his technique is at its peak, where he's getting a lot of record dates, he's writing, and some of the stuff he's creating on the fly. I mean, he didn't always write things down ahead of time, but he had that ability, as Parker did, to maybe have nothing more than a sketch, enter a recording session, and then flesh things out verbally or demonstrating on the piano. And it's 49 to 51. That's his greatest records, and that's where he's intersecting with all these other great artists, including Sonny Stitt, and that's both his great period and the great period for bebop.
Sonny Stitt. Now, I noticed the bebop musicians were pretty competitive, but there was an anecdote where it seemed like Bud Powell was kind of very respectful of Sonny Stitt's abilities as a musician. And you interviewed Sonny Stitt, right? Could you talk a little bit about their relationship? No?
Yeah, I did not interview Sonny Stitt. The anecdote you're referring to came from someone who was a witness to the session.
Okay.
It was important that my book give as many perspectives as possible. And so many jazz books, biographies or histories, rely on the words of musicians. Well, that's, of course, critically important. But there's other perspectives, too. This music, especially at the peak of modern jazz, and we were talking about that era, attracted people, young people for the most part, and there was a thrill from being on the scene. The average fan, or if he was hip and wanted to be part of it, he liked to talk about the musicians as if he knew them. And they hung out before and after the gigs to get the autograph or to talk to them, and they couldn't wait for this stuff to happen. So I wanted the perspective of people who were listeners, people who paid their money to go to see it or hung out, didn't have the money, they hung outside. But I wanted the perspective of those fanatics for whom they couldn't get enough of this music. So I did get, from many of the record sessions, eyewitnesses. These are not musicians. They're not the producers of the session. They're just people who were hanging out. And this anecdote about Sonny Stitt came from somebody who was invited to watch. He was in the recording booth, and he saw what was happening as the musicians warmed up and then played the tunes. And I thought that was a perspective that was worth having. This guy told a story about Stitt and Powell having something of a tense relationship, which was partly to do with mutual respect and admiration. They were both virtuosos, but partly Stitt had a way of needling Powell. Remember, they were young. All these musicians were very young. And once Stitt saw that he could get under Powell's skin and needle him, he took advantage of it. So when he said to this eyewitness or to somebody, don't worry, I'll get Powell there. In other words, I know how to handle him. And it meant that he knew that Powell respected his technique, and at the same time, Stitt was just a little more mature or a little cagier, and that he could do what he needed to. If he had to manipulate Powell, if he had to make fun of Powell, if he had to dare Powell to show up, that kind of thing. Whatever psychology Stitt had, it worked with Powell. And in the only interview that Powell ever gave that we know of, that was recorded, he cited Sonny Stitt as a favorite. And this was it was years later, and he had, the guy was Powell was a terrible interview. He didn't like to talk. Not if he knew he was being interviewed. But the interviewer was saying, well, why don't you name some musicians, and he wanted him to talk about Charlie Parker, and he didn't want to talk about Charlie Parker. And he said, what about Sonny Stitt? And then what he was saying is, I like Sonny Stitt. I want to talk about Sonny Stitt. I don't want to talk about anybody else. So they had this, it was unusual relationship. And Stitt, I think, had a little power over him.
That's a great segue, because at some point, the relationship with Charlie Parker just, I guess, absolutely deteriorated, because there's a famous scene that you detail very brilliantly in your book where it's, I guess, one of the final gigs that they do, and it's an absolute travesty. I mean, like, it's just a performance that's falling apart. Charles Mingus was there. Charlie Parker's trying to run a gig and it's just failing. Bud Powell's being very difficult. Could you talk about that? How many perspectives you got of that famous falling out?
Oh, thank you for mentioning the number. I think I had 9 different perspectives, as many of them from living interviewees as I could, and I favored the people whom I could pretty much tell were really there. I call it the Last Supper. Parker to me was the ultimate martyr in jazz. He died at the same age as Jesus Christ, and to me. As soon as he died, people saying "Bird lives" and all that. I mean, he was a figure, a charismatic figure, because of his extraordinary talent. That I think to this day, that in fact this is the centenary. Charlie Parker was born in 1920, and I hope there's going to be some activities about that. He was just he picked up that horn, and Dizzy Gillespie said he was a Pied Piper. Powell, I think, when he started to his celebrity rose, felt, well, what about me? Why don't people congregate around me the way they do around him? I can do everything on my instrument that he does on the saxophone. So for this last gig, whether Powell consciously decided to sabotage it or whether he was just very sick, and I do document some unfortunate incidents that happened in the lead up to this. So it's rather than saying definitively, well, Powell just wanted to screw it up because it was Parker's gig and not Powell's, right? This was Birdland, and Powell had played at Birdland many, many, many times. I think he was also the circumstances of Powell's mental health at the time. But I talked to everybody I could who was there. There's a couple of people who claimed to have been there, but I don't think they were. I think that many years later, because it was Parker's last gig, the Last Supper, I think that the incidents that happened were blown out of proportion, and that people who weren't there wanted to pretend they were, so that some celebrity would rub off on them. So it all is in the book. It's unfortunate, no matter whose perspective you follow or believe in, but it was clearly a breakdown, and Powell hardly played at all. Parker left the stage terribly upset. Charles Mingus tried to hold things together. Art Blakey tried to hold things together. But it was a disaster. Very little music was played until I think the second or third set, where Parker just played some blues. And Kenny Dorham played well that night by most accounts. But it's a historic event for the wrong reason.
Yes, exactly. Can I actually step a little bit earlier than that? And there was this, I think it was an anecdote where I think Lenny Tristano and Charlie Parker are sitting, and Bud Powell just walks up to them and just rips into Charlie Parker and just tells him he's like not playing well or just,
Yeah.
I'm not sure can you talk about that anecdote and where you got that from?
Well, that I got from a book, so I'm always wary when I do that. In fact, I did something that no reader has noticed, but it was important to me to do it for history. Where I have an anecdote that I got from a printed source, and the printed source seems to have gotten the anecdote from another printed source, or where you could it's just palimpsest. It's just so many layers, and the harder it is. The more layers there are, the harder it is to believe the actual words. So I put extra quote marks around these kind of things to signal, well, I don't know. This is what I read somewhere, and where I read it, he got it from someone else. And, it's just between oral traditions and written traditions, things get very murky when you're trying to determine the truth. All I know is that according to one printed source, which was based on somebody's hearsay, Tristano, who idolized Parker, was sitting with him in a club, and probably was Birdland. And Powell saw that, and I'm going to guess that he was jealous that Tristano was talking to Parker and not Powell. And he just wanted to take a swipe at him. So he said, I won't repeat the exact words, but he said he was playing, that it was nothing, that Parker was just a shell of himself. He was falling back on old routines, and that is when he bothered to show up. He wasn't the great talent anymore, and it was Powell's way of saying, I'm the boss now. I'm the big name. And Powell was also probably at this time, he also had gone through his problems. In fact, they were both hospitalized at Bellevue, which was an observation ward for potential psychiatric patients. They were both hospitalized there at the end of 1954. I think they were, it's like two guys missing each other at a club, only they missed each other at a hospital. They were both there, maybe a few weeks apart, but that shows you how both of their careers were in decline because of substance abuse and emotional problems. So here's Powell seeing Parker. Parker's in decline, so Powell feels, let me take a swipe at him. But Powell wasn't doing any better.
As I think a testament to the intimidating influence of Bud Powell. I mean, and I don't know if I got this from the Francis Poitras biography, but maybe you can correct me. But even someone like Errol Garner, who everyone just agrees is a genius, is it true that somebody asked him to follow a set or play after Bud? He said, "I'm not going to do that."
Oh, that wasn't Errol Garner. I got that directly from some musicians, some pianists, who felt that once Powell had played, there was nothing that they could do. That Powell had played with such intensity and had, in his prime, was able to just toss out so many exciting ideas that the other pianists felt, well, I don't know what I could do. In some cases, Ray Bryant told me this. Ray Bryant was playing, and Powell came up and bumped him off the piano bench. I mean, it's the middle of playing, and Powell was saying, in effect, you don't know what you're doing. In effect, sometimes he'd even say that. He'd say, get out of the way. You don't know what you're doing. And take the play. And I remember asking Mr. Bryant, well, what did you do? And Bryant looked at me. He said, well, what did I do? It's Bud Powell. Of course I got out of it. Not, I'm going to reassert myself because it's my gig. No, I get out of the way. So I think that Powell had that ability to play with such authority that the other person didn't want to play. However, with Errol Garner, that's not true. And I have an eyewitness to, I think it's a 1949, it's a club in Midtown, I think it was the Three Deuces, where they appeared all opposite each other. And that the thrill of sitting there and watching Garner play a terrific set with, nothing but fresh improvisation, tune after tune, and then Powell taking the piano bench and saying to himself, I'll show this crowd, I'll outplay him. And then Garner coming back for another set, and this guy said, I sat there, I knew I was seeing something unique. Two great players, each looking to top the other, and He said, who was the beneficiary of this? Neither of them. I was. I got to experience all of their genius. They were too busy doing battle.
Okay, next person. Oscar Peterson and Bud Powell. I think there was a bit of tension there. I think they had a run-in in Paris, right?
Yes. Peterson's star started to arise in, I guess about 49 when Norman Granz brought him to New York, if the date is correct. And from that time, shortly afterwards, he signed a deal with Granz. And Granz was someone who repaid promptness and reliability and such and good behavior with healthy sums to record. And, of course, he wanted, as any employer would, a contract which would secure the his right to record the artist. And Peterson was very pliant and was amenable to whatever Granz wanted him to do, and he was rewarded for that. So Granz really helped to make Peterson a celebrity, and this bothered Powell. Powell had recorded for Granz a number of times, but Granz found him unreliable, difficult to deal with, and so he did not keep him under contract. As soon as he made the required number of sessions, Granz did not renew the contract. And I think that this hurt Powell terribly, and when Powell was living in Paris from 1959, he, on the one hand, was eager to see expatriate musicians or those who were just coming to tour. He always wanted to see them and have a word with them, have a drink with them, and play with them, but not Peterson. And when Peterson was in Paris for a gig, Powell was ambivalent about seeing him. However, somebody who was taking care of Powell at the time said, "Come on, let's go to the hotel where he's staying. Let's say hello." Just as a courtesy, he's a fellow jazz musician. You know him a long time. So they went to see him at the hotel, and if this eyewitness can be trusted, I'm not sure he can, he said that they went to the desk and asked for Peterson's room or something, and that Peterson refused to see them.
Oh my goodness.
And that supposedly Powell said, "I think Oscar has a swelled head." Now, I don't know that any of that is true, but that's what has made it into the jazz lore. And so if I tell the story in the book, I'm careful to, again, use extra quote marks and signal. I don't know if this is true. But they didn't like each other. That's pretty clear.
I noticed as you're telling me these things, I'm actually referencing the Francis Poudre book, and I'm noticing you're, in a way, correcting. So was Francis Poudre kind of an unreliable biographer in that regard?
Well, that's putting it diplomatically. He was extremely unreliable, and he was unreliable actually for a very good reason. He loved Bud Powell, and he tried as best he could to get Powell to stop drinking, to get Powell to clean up himself, and to make him a good performer when Powell was in very bad shape in Europe. And Poudras was very young at the time, and it's extraordinary that he had some insight into Powell's problems and felt that by showing him respect and admiration and looking after him in the small ways, providing meals for him when he could, buying him clean clothes, new clothes when he could, and then ultimately getting Powell to move in with him so that he could watch him all the time and look out for him in all those, ways, those domestic ways that partners do for artists. The good reason that he's unreliable as a chronicler of the Bud Powell in his times is that he loved him, and he did all he could to straighten him out and to get him back to the kind of performing life and a healthy performing life. And he ultimately failed to do that. But in the time they had together, which is exaggerated in Poudras's book, it's not nearly as long as he said it was. But in the time they had together, he showed him respect and affection and a respect for the art that meant after Powell died, Poudras sensing that he had a place in history because he took care of someone who had a place in history, that it was necessary to polish the stories, to exaggerate things, because he recognized that he was now somebody whom people wanted to know about.
Can we talk about the Art Tatum Bud Powell cutting contest that happened, so to speak?
Well, I don't recall an actual cutting contest. I recall Powell going to see Tatum play a number of times. I don't, unless I'm not remembering something in the book, I don't think that Powell ever took...
If I can remember correctly, there was an anecdote where Bud Powell took to the microphone and said to Art Tatum, "Let's see him top that," or something like that.
Oh, well, I guess there were times, I know there were times when Powell went to see Tatum play. There's no question of that. And I do document through an interview I did with a musician who was there, an eyewitness, to Powell watching Tatum play and admiring him so, but not being in good enough shape to play at all. Again, if it was Tatum's gig, I have trouble. That's the one pianist he would not have bumped off the stool or anything like that.
Yeah.
I do know there's a story, and again, it's just an anecdote. We don't know if it's true, that Tatum finished a set and came off the bandstand. I remember he was blind, so he had help coming off the bandstand. And Powell went up to him. Now, maybe Tatum already knew he was there because he knew that Powell admired him and revered his technique. And supposedly Powell went up to him and corrected wrong notes that he had played. And I think that Tatum had played something classical, and Powell wanted to show off, so he said to him where his mistakes were. And then there may be a time where it was Powell's gig and Tatum was there, and maybe it was an after-hours joint or something, and Tatum was going to play, and maybe Powell came off the bandstand and said, "Let's see him top that." But I don't know that that's true, and I don't, unless my memory is failing, I can't believe that there was a formal Art Tatum gig in a club, and Powell took the stand and tried to do something. I just don't think he would have done that.
Can you talk about that? There's one song that Bud Powell played called Move, and he got like a standing ovation from the club or something after his solo.
Oh,
Do you remember that anecdote?
yeah. Oh, well, that is one of my favorites. You're picking all the good ones, I must say.
I love your book. What can I say?
Well, you do like the ones where he's where there's some sort of tension and two great giants are doing some kind of battle or whatever. But this one's not like that. This is a pure love affair. I got it from Cy Johnson, composer, arranger, a man who has a place in jazz history, but generally known only to musicians. Most famously, he worked with Charles Mingus for a good spell. And he was there that night at Birdland. It was a Monday night, so it was the one night when the scheduled acts didn't play. So it was a jam night, or when other people could have an opportunity to play at the most famous jazz club. And this was members of mostly of the Gil Evans, Miles Davis, that ambit, the guys who were referred to as those who played on Birth of the Cool. So it was a number of the Birth of the Cool musicians. And Powell was scheduled. It was just this one night. It was the off night, but it was announced that Powell was going to play piano with them. So while it wasn't a week's gig, it wasn't completely spontaneous. This Cy Johnson heard on the radio that this band, which they weren't calling Birth of the Cool Band, I don't think, in 1949, but in effect, that's what we think of them now, those kind of players. Jerry Mulligan was in the band. And Bud Powell was going to be on piano for this one night only. So Johnson went, and he saw this thing happen where they called Move, which I believe is on Birth of the Cool, and the album. And Powell, whether he was that familiar with the music, I don't know, because there were 1948 live performances of that band. Birth of the Cool sessions are 49, but I don't know that he knew the tune. Or if he did, I don't think he knew what the Birth of the Cool Band, as we call it, was doing. But he just had his opening, the band laid out and let him solo, and he played something that was to musicians of such an unprecedented level of technical acumen and fresh ideas that they nearly stopped playing. I mean, after the solo, they had to come back in for the out chorus, and according to the eyewitness, people were just dumbstruck, and nobody knew what to do because he had played something beyond anyone's imagination. And this story ends with Powell sort of frozen on stage and Jerry Mulligan coming over to help him off the stage. Whether he was play acting, I don't know, but it seemed that even Bud Powell was stunned by what he had played. And it was something that Cy Johnson obviously never forgot. It was one of the great moments that he ever witnessed in music.
There's a jazz educator and pianist that's really enjoying a resurgence thanks to YouTube. His name is Barry Harris, and he's very cryptic in ways that he talks about Bud Powell. And I was wondering, have you interviewed him about the book, and do you know their personal relationship?
Well, I interviewed him before I started writing the book because when I put together the complete Bud Powell on Verve, the 5-CD set, it was decided by my boss, Michael Lang, and I to bring Barry Harris into a recording studio and play him the tracks that are on those discs and get his reaction, to record his voice talking about what Bud Powell is doing, because we knew that Barry Harris is, to use the cliche, the keeper of the Bud Powell flame. More than any other pianist, and there are others who were heavily influenced by Bud Powell, Walter Davis, Walter Bishop, these kinds of guys. But Barry Harris is the Bud Powell guy. He's the disciple. And so we brought him in the studio, and he talked about what he got from the particular tracks, which ones he liked, where he thought Powell really did something new, where he felt Bud Powell was falling down. I mean, he was very candid, and he was very emotional because this meant so much to him. And in and around that time, he did talk to me about other aspects of Bud Powell's playing and his intersection with Powell, which happened in a hotel across the street from Birdland. Barry Harris was not living in New York yet, so he was touring, I think, and he came to New York and he stayed at the hotel across the street from Birdland, and that's where he ran into Bud Powell. So I had some personal anecdotes. Barry Harris also saw Powell play in 1964 when he returned from Paris to what turned out to be his final residence, which here in New York. I don't think he knew when he came back to play Birdland. He came back for a gig at Birdland in 64. I don't think he knew that this is where he would die, but in fact he never returned to Paris. And Barry Harris was there on opening night. And it was a big deal. Most of the media covered it, not just the jazz press, but I think Time magazine and a couple of other of the big magazines covered it. Jazz press was all over it. And Barry Harris was there opening night, and he talked about that. So I felt comfortable writing the book that I had the perspective of this great disciple. I have not talked to him since the book came out. I doubt that he's read it. I don't think he cares. I think he has his love of Bud Powell, and Barry Harris is a great inspiration himself for his teaching. He's been a teacher for, 40 years or more, and I don't think he cares what I say about Bud Powell.
To end off, is it true that Bud Powell was sitting in and watching a concert of John Coltrane and enjoying it? And I think he did a cover of even Moment's Notice, which is one of Coltrane's tunes. What's the Bud Powell and John Coltrane connection?
I don't know of any, to tell you the truth. It's obvious that Coltrane was making the rounds in the mid-50s when Powell was still here. It's Coltrane's entire career is so well documented. He's such a hero, an icon, really, much more of an icon in jazz than Bud Powell is. So, if I remember, Coltrane was recording a lot for Prestige, 56. He'd been, of course, with Miles, and then he did his own sessions at Prestige. So Powell was aware of him. I have no idea if he went to a club to hear him play, probably. But Bud Powell, by 56 or so, when he isn't touring with Birdland All-Stars, which I document, again, for my witnesses who were on that tour, I don't think was making the scene much. He probably saw Coltrane somewhere, but there is no evidence that he did. There's no evidence of Bud Powell hanging out in clubs in 57 and 58. These are not good years for him. He made a few records, and then in 59 he moved to Paris. So it's the time that he moved to Paris that Coltrane's star really rose. 59, he's with Atlantic, right? And then he gets with Impulse. And by the time Powell comes back, and I think it's an interesting question, because what Powell didn't know was what was happening on the scene between 59 and 64. He heard reports from musicians who came over to tour. Sonny Rollins toured in 59 and probably again after that. Dexter Gordon. There were great artists who were coming to Europe. So if Powell had conversations with them, they probably told him, well, you don't know what's going on, man. This guy's hitting, and this guy's hitting over here, and this guy's been making tons of records. This guy's on radio, but he wasn't experiencing it. So I don't think there was any relationship. And when he came back in 64, Coltrane is an enormous star. And I don't, and Powell was also hearing about younger artists, newer artists who were just beginning to break through. Cecil Taylor. Taylor idolized Powell. And Taylor was just, sort of hanging out at small places. Bill Evans was a big star. So these were all names to him, but I don't think he had anything to do with them. I think Pozras was championing Evans, and I think he tried to get Powell to go to see Evans. Evans was headlining by 64, and I think they did go, but I have no evidence of him going to see Coltrane play. If he did Moment's Notice, yeah, probably he was asked to do it. It's on one of those very late, very bad recordings that Powell did. And I think the record producer, knowing of Coltrane's celebrity, thought, hey, let's do a Coltrane tune. I wouldn't be surprised if Powell didn't know it and didn't want to admit he didn't know it, so he fumbled through it or something. No, I don't think there's anything. There was a rumor of them playing together in 1952. Some discographer of Coltrane had it. I contacted the guy and I said, Bud Powell was in a psychiatric hospital for all of 1952. He wasn't appearing with John Coltrane anywhere.
Now, I mean, I have to say, Peter, your book is really a tremendous, tremendous accomplishment, and you've really corrected a lot of the history. You've added so much. You've actually created opportunities for more research. Can I ask you, how's the reaction been to your book? Have artists who've read the book reached out to you and asked you questions like I'm asking you now more about Bud? I'm sure he's such a famous influence on so many current top musicians. How has the response been to your book?
Well, I think that there are about 9 Nikhil Hogans around the world, and they exist in different locations, and they have been extremely kind in contacting me to tell me that they liked my work. But there's only about 9 of you. And the larger public, between those people who are not readers, and it's a big book, it's a long book, so that tends to put some people off, between people who don't read much and people who are scared off by books that are heavily documented, scholarly. Some people are scared off when they see that there are endnotes. I felt it necessary to credit every piece of information I got.
It's like a dissertation.
Again, yes, it is. And I felt that that's going to turn some people off. But you were very kind to say a moment ago that it sets a standard for others to come along and inspires others to do more research and even to correct me where I'm wrong. I think that there is within the world of people who write jazz books, there's a small subset of us. We are a minority who want to, as the cliche has it, dot every I and cross every T. And if we're going to do that, we want to credit the people we got our information from so that they get the respect they deserve, and to correct those whom we got the wrong information from. But this sets a tone for someone to come along and do the same for an artist who has never been treated in a biography. And there are many, many artists out there, and not just jazz, who deserve this kind of treatment, a close examination. As I say, though, there are a few of you out there, and I'm very grateful to you, and they tend to write me. My email address is at my website, and of course I, at this point, have many more ebook readers than I do paperback readers. I wish people would buy the paperback. It means a little more for me in my pocket, but I knew that around the world there are Bud Powell fans, and it's expensive because I have to pay the postage. So on top of the book. So I'm grateful that there's a guy in Singapore who read my ebook. Now I have to ask you a question.
Yeah.
How did you learn of the book?
I mean, at some point, and I think it was falling into the Barry Harris ambit and getting very excited about Bebop eventually. And, Barry Harris would talk about Charlie Parker, talk about Bud Powell a lot. And who is this Bud Powell guy? And then I'd look for a biography, and I'd see Francis Poitras. And then I think sometime it was mentioned that your book was released. And I said, great, there's an even bigger book that I can check out. And I just went into it. And like I said, I know it's 400 pages, but it's too short. It's too short. And it really is, you should submit it for an award or something, or release a second edition, because, it's really a towering achievement. And I will keep telling people to buy it and read it, because I think if you're a jazz musician, you should know this stuff.
I hope that this show will be heard by people, and some people want the paperback. They like to hold it in their hands and look at it on the shelf and look at the photo and the cover and everything. So yes, I prefer people buy the paperback. But I will say that there is a prestigious award that's given every year to the best book in music. And it's interesting, it needn't be a jazz artist, but it tends to go to jazz subjects most of the time. It's called ASCAP Deems Taylor. And I submitted the book. I had to send them 4 or 5 copies. Those are copies I can't get back. Those are sales I can't get. But I thought, well, this will be worth it if I get the award. And I don't even know that anybody looked at it. I mean, I was never considered. They didn't say, well, we've nominated it or you're in consideration. So that ASCAP Deems Taylor Award, it seems, goes to books that are not so scholarly. They go to books that are more popular. And I think it's a shame because one of the great things about having a book with all this information is you can pick and choose. You don't have to read it all. In fact, one of the best reviews I got, and people do review it at Amazon. I ask people when they buy the paperback, submit a review to Amazon as if you're buying the ebook. The computers at Amazon don't know that, so those reviews are my best marketing tool. And one of the reviewers who read the ebook said, it's got all this scholarly stuff in it, but if you're not interested, you can just read the story. It's an amazing story of a man who had this extraordinary ability, but whose personality and whose personal problems were such that he was only able to shine at the peak of his powers for a short time. And that time is very precious. It's the height of modern jazz. He was right there with all the other greats, and he made music that'll last forever. But the story, unfortunately, has these other elements to it. And so you do read, and you hope that Bud Powell's going to come back and he's going to be great again, and you're rooting him on. And he has some later in his life. He had a few periods where he was able to make a good record or have a good concert. Then he kind of, fell by the wayside again. But it's a story. It's a story with a lot of human emotion in it, and the story you can't help but feel for Powell. You can't help but root him on, and you can't help but feel that this man, if only he'd had a little help, if somebody had looked after him. I think that's the theme of the book. If somebody had wanted to take him under his or her care, he might have made more great music. So for those who don't care about all these details of when he went where and what he was paid and who the record producer was, you don't have to bother with any of that. And that's what this reviewer said. Just enjoy the story.
Can I just end off with, you've conducted so many interviews. Who was the most helpful interview in your research? Who you felt was very objective, very accurate, very forthcoming?
Well, I think Johnny Griffin has to stand out because I wanted so much all of the musicians to give me all of themselves, and musicians are not politicians. They're not spokespeople. They're artists. And I think I had expectations that certain musicians were going to give me the very best memories and the most touching anecdotes and the best insight into Bud Powell. And they didn't, because that's not what they do. They are professional musicians, and they give their heart and their minds when they're on the bandstand playing. And I found that most musicians, even the ones, and most of them were kind, there were a few who were pretty nasty, but 95% of them were good and kind and gave me their time, which is precious to them. But they spoke like musicians. So they spoke in a shorthand, or they kind of, in the middle of a story, they kind of drifted off, or they only hinted at things. Sometimes they were protecting themselves. Sometimes they thought they were protecting Powell. I had musicians who told me, I'm not going to get into that stuff. I had many musicians say that to me. You're asking me about the bad stuff? I'm not getting into it. In other words, we're a college. We're a college of performers. We don't tell on each other. But Johnny Griffin was an artist, a great musician, but also a great person. And he didn't talk to me like a musician. He talked to me like a person. And if I asked him a question, he did his best to answer it without thinking, well, what will other musicians say about this? Or, gee, I can't do that. We have to hang together. So I'd say for insight and humanity, Johnny Griffin. If you want to talk about the other stuff, I have a lot of people who gave me a lot of information. Maxwell Cohen, who's the second hero there are two heroes in the story, Thelonious Monk, of course, and Maxwell Cohen, an attorney who managed to do a lot for musicians in general. It would take a long time to explain it. But he was instrumental in my understanding the politics of jazz music, in particular of nightclub performance. because there was a lot of politics involved, New York City politics. And Cohen was instrumental in getting the laws changed to help musicians. So from that point of view, he's as I said, he's the other hero of the story.
Peter Pullman, the author of Wail, The Life of Bud Powell. It is a phenomenal book. It's an outstanding biography of this great artist and is incredibly well researched and footnoted. I recommend everybody buy it because this is a very important musician. And not only that, it's a very well done biography, which is, and as someone who reads a lot of biographies, it's really refreshing to have that level of detail and objectivity and research. So where can fans and people who are interested in following your work reach out to you?
www.budpowell, Bud Powell, bio. So as an email address, as a website, it's www.budpowellbio.com. budpowellbio.com. That's how you can find it.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Peter. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you, Nikhil. It's been a pleasure.